Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And today we're talking about Fedora, and probably a bit about Sunset Boulevard as well. Sunset Boulevard you'll definitely have heard of. Fedora you might not have. It's another Billy Wilder film from 1978, so 28 years after Sunset Boulevard. And in some ways it covers kind of similar territory and similar themes. It's another one that's been put on Mubi as a perfect failure. And to be honest with you, I couldn't really see why.
Well, because it was a disaster at the box office.
Well, yeah, okay. But I suppose I couldn't see why it was a perfect failure in the same way that Southland Tales was, that we saw recently.
It's an odd film because, it's a film that you can imagine every cinephile loving. But I also understand why it was a failure at the box office. And I do think that once you get cinephiles obsessing, through auteurist routes, and, kind of picking up on minutiae of a director's style or something, you sometimes lose the forest for the trees. And I can understand why this was not successful. There are a lot of things wrong with it. Primarily, Marthe Keller's central performance. I mean, she looks the part, but I think she's quite inadequate to acting the part. And it's a central problem with the film.
It doesn't help that her dialogue is dubbed.
Yes.
Her and the other actress, Hildegard Knef.
Yes.
Both of their voices were dubbed by the same actress, Inga Bunch. And, because the characters are sort of supposed to be the same, or that there's certainly a kind of identity confluence between them, that kind of makes thematic sense. But, it comes out of Wilder sort of realising that they were unintelligible to listen to. And it does kind of... there's something off about it. It wasn't until I finished watching the movie and looked it up that I realised that's what it was.
Yes.
But there was something off about that.
It was quite common in these transnational productions from the 70s that had all-star casts from different countries to always have something dubbed in it, right? So my understanding is that Marthe Keller dubbed the French version, and then in the German version, Hildegard Knef spoke her part, but other people were dubbed, right? So kind of that's not uncommon in countries where most of the mainstream releases were dubbed in those periods, right? So there are probably like several versions with different voices. Yeah, so orally, these transnational films are always a dilemma. There's always something that sounds slightly tinny about it, yeah? I was watching the conversation, the conversation the other day, and it's the same thing. There's an English version where you hear Burt Lancaster's voice. There's an Italian version, where you hear everybody else's voice, right? Stefano Mangano and Claudia Cardinale and so on. So that is just a feature of this transnational production of the period. But I'm thinking even further than that. This is a film, which I loved, by the way, but in which you can imagine you have somebody else in your head that can do the parts better, every part. Yeah? So, for example, the Marthe Keller part, I thought, wouldn't Faye Dunaway have been great? Yeah, kind of playing the daughter, right? Wouldn't Marlene Dietrich have been great playing the Countess, right? Wouldn't Warren Beatty have been a million times better than Michael York playing Michael York? Right? Like, yeah.
Well, I quite liked Michael York, to be fair.
I think he's
he's a blank, and he's a very pretty blank, but I kind of felt like that was the almost the point of his character, I suppose. He represents youth and something different and what the girl wants. And I suppose I also just associate him so heavily with the role of Basil Exposition in Austin Powers that every time they said Michael York, it just made me laugh. I know that's not the intention, but I found it funny. And then he's very self-effacing when he gets to that point where it's his only real sort of bit on screen, where he talks about wetting himself with excitement when he saw this actress when he was 6 years old. And I thought, for someone who's playing himself especially, I quite like that. I thought it was quite bold,
Well, I didn't. I thought he spoke everything like an automaton. He was like, he was unbelievable even as himself. Though, he is very pretty, but actually, you know, he lacks he lacks excitement. You can't imagine anyone committing suicide over Michael York.
Well,
so,
that is true. Yeah.
so I think that's a central failure in the film, and actually it extends to William Holden, right? Who I think is wonderful in the part, but I do think he's too old, right? I mean,
Well,
yes, he is. He's supposed to be like 20 years younger than she, right? So,
yeah, yeah.
when you see him as an assistant director in 1927, he's meant to be 23, 25, right? Yeah. So and also I think the film would have been more dynamic, yeah, with, you know, kind of a younger actor in that part. He is to me a bit too old. Yeah.
Do you think he's been cast because it reflects his role in Sunset Boulevard? Because there's so much in this film that seems so deliberate about that. Do you think that's one of those things?
No, my understanding is that, he was cast because even in this period, he was quite a big name. And Billy Wilder couldn't get somebody else. And I think, his age was an issue in the casting. And it was something that was considered and overridden. But, he looks his age. And I think he's a bit too old. And I think the film would have been more glamorous, better with somebody younger. With a William Holden in the 50s, yeah, the way he looked and moved and so on in the 1950s rather than, here, which is almost like it's 1978. It's, so I think all of those are real problems with the film for me.
I do know what you mean. With his age, though, I suppose I didn't really think about it too heavily, but I didn't have a problem with it. It seemed to make sense to me, and there's a tone to the film which is all about aging and looking back and the comparison between the way things were and the way we are now. And his age spoke to that to me, because there's that moment towards the end where he's been told this whole story about the awful thing that these people have done, and then he reconnects that memory that you've seen in flashback previously of when he slept with Fedora when she was a huge star. And they reconnect over a memory of it, and he says, "Oh, you do remember?" And the fact that they are so old and life has gone so far and so on, that all seemed to kind of connect for me.
Well,
I rather like that.
It didn't for me, and actually, it's kind of unimaginable. Like what you needed was the William Holden of Sunset Boulevard, the way he looked then. Because in a way, he's playing a similar kind of part. He's somebody who's young and hustling, or who's hustling to get a film made, right? And he's on his uppers, he can't get help. Somebody in his 60s, I also think you can't quite imagine it that way, really. Not also if he's like produced all these films and had some hits and had nominations. You just can't imagine him on the make like that at that age. So
I don't know. I kind of bought it. Well, I didn't kind of buy it. I did buy it. He's desperate at this point. He's had some failures. He wants to get back. He sees a way back. Fedora is desperate in different ways, and they share a similarity.
Well,
they're both desperate people.
I mean, he's such a good actor, and he's very good in this, William Holden. So I can see why it kind of works. I'm just saying, kind of it doesn't really. And I think if he'd had a Robert Redford or a Jack Nicholson playing that part in that time, the film would have been better. It would have been more dynamic. It would have been more successful. I think the casting in this film is a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly appears to be the case that they had kind of trouble getting money for the film and getting made and so on and so forth. So I'm sure that all kind of connects. The big problem for me in the film was the structure. It's so interesting for such a long time, although it does start off with a very cheap storytelling trick. Again, this is something that Sunset Boulevard does as well, 2 weeks earlier. So we start off with the death of this woman, this star we're told in voiceover, and then 2 weeks earlier, what happened and how did it lead to this? And I always find that such a cheap storytelling trick. I think you never find it, in a really good film. It's always something that kind of betrays a lack of faith in your own story. We don't trust our story to maintain interest. we have to promise something that's going to happen.
No, I don't buy that. I think that's a very legitimate kind of storytelling device, and in fact, you see it everywhere. And you see it in like lots of film noir, and I think it, kind of Sunset Boulevard itself disproves what you're saying. Here's a really great film that has that device.
I disagree because I don't like it in Sunset Boulevard, but maybe we'll get onto that. I really didn't like the structure of Sunset Boulevard. But in Fedora, then once you've got past that and the story kind of starts developing, and you see what amounts to, I suppose, an extended flashback of the character of William Holden's time in Corfu, looking for Fedora and finding out there seems to be something very weird going on with this family that surrounds her, and she's not being let out, and so on and so forth. Then her funeral happens, and so you kind of catch up with the start of the film, and the whole second half of the film is just exposition. It's exposition that's dramatised through flashback and cutaway, but ultimately it's just the family telling the story of what happened to William Holden, and I just don't really buy it. The only thing that I buy ultimately, the only reason I believed ultimately that they were going through telling him the story is because she remembers him. She remembers him and she likes him, and that's why she would bother to go through explaining everything. But actually I didn't like the storytelling. I didn't like how every now and again you go back to the Contessa, then what happened next? Then what happened next? Then what happened next? I had a real problem with that structure.
Well,
I think it's lazy.
I didn't. I liked all of that, though. Maybe I am also myself reading it through the cinephile lens. Because I found it riveting. Every time they said something, I imagined like Dietrich or Garbo, primarily Dietrich. And of course, you're thinking about celebrity and glamour and kind of what a movie star is, and images and mirrors and so on. So, and I thought kind of all of those things kind of really cohered in kind of like really interesting ways, right? And, kind of, questions of identity, the erasure of the daughter's identity, and how little that matters in relation to image and things like that. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, there are things around it that I find fascinating. There are things thematically that I find really fascinating. I just didn't like the way that it was being delivered, basically. Something that I thought about both films is they seem to both have they obviously have a kind of low opinion of Hollywood in some respects, and sort of youth culture in some respects, and the way that stars are treated, or kind of star psychology maybe. But it also occurred to me that they both seem to have quite a low opinion of women.
Ah, that's interesting.
I didn't think it was a coincidence that the kind of central characters in these films who they go mad in different ways. One of them goes madder than the other. It didn't seem to me to be a coincidence that they're both women. It seemed to me to be there seemed to be an association between being a woman and beauty, and the fear of loss of beauty, and stardom and ego. The films would play differently if it were a man in that central role, I think.
Well, it definitely would play different if it was a man in the central role. And I'm interested in what you're saying. I mean, I don't think it's the first time that Wilder has been accused of misogyny. But, in opposition to Fedora, you have the other Fedora. Yeah, you have her mother, right? Which is, I think it's really based on Dietrich, that kind of sense of self-discipline and will and single-mindedness and so on. And actually her relationship with her daughter, Maria Riva. Her daughter wrote a wonderful book, on her mother that has many of these dynamics that you see in this film. And, those are all kind of very powerful women. So actually, even the Gloria Swanson, Norma Desmond character in Sunset Boulevard, on the one hand, she's kind of going nuts and obsesses with her image and her stardom. On the other hand, she's a really strong, powerful, willful, kind of, she's not like a blushing wallflower, right, or a weak person.
That's very true, yeah.
So
she expresses her madness in a very strong, independent way.
That's right. So,
yeah.
I love this film because also, I mean, it's very interesting because, so for example, the film begins and you could really see how Wilder is thinking visually, right? This romantic idea, a train is coming, a woman throws herself on the train. It's kind of, it's such a poetic, almost gothic kind of idea, right? But then I also thought it isn't filmed romantically and gothically. I thought that was, you know, so there's something for me about the visuals, which are sometimes very beautiful, and sometimes really succeed, those shots of Corfu and so on. But actually, kind of, there are other elements which I think could have been visualized more excitingly, more dynamically. The moment in the train is one of them. The moment where they're actually filming that ball sequence is another. Yeah, it somehow lacked sweep and excitement and delirium. Yeah, what you would expect Fedora to be feeling at that moment.
It's funny actually because in that scene you're shown that the camera that is filming this scene, the camera within the scene, is sitting on a crane and it's doing this sweep down through the players. But the camera you're watching it from is just doing a track
Yes.
on the ground, and it's so you're looking at a shot that you could be seeing,
Yes.
that you're not. You know.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I do think the film is a failure, but I loved it. Yeah, in spite of all of those
A
faults.
failure is an interesting kind of it's an interesting term. I think we have to kind of define it because, as you say, if it made absolutely no money and it kind of dribbled out and was criticised and so on, then it is a failure of a sort. But if we liked it and found interesting things in it, there are things that I think are deeply flawed. I don't like the way it's structured, that kind of thing. But I liked it basically all the way through. Right, I wasn't bored for a second. Maybe I think one of the lessons also that I learned tonight, again, something that I learned with Sunset Boulevard, and it's a lesson that I love and I keep returning to and I keep forgetting and I keep relearning, is the power and value of low expectations. Because when a film is presented to you as a perfect failure, your expectations could not be lower. And so to find out that the film is kind of pretty good in some ways, you go, well, wonderful. Whereas when you're told a film is one of the greatest ever, as is the case with Sunset Boulevard, I ended up looking at what I felt were problems and flaws and things I didn't like. Some I'm sure of which would fade in second and third and fourth viewings. But my initial response to Sunset Boulevard was not all that positive, I must be honest with you.
Well, I never get tired of watching it, and there are shots in that film that are really indelible and that actually I don't think there's anything like it in Fedora. Yeah, so Gloria Swanson.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Coming down the stairs, things like that are just like fantastic, kind of visually, thematically, dramatically, right? And it combines all of those things. I think this film is a bit flat visually. So and that would be like my main criticism. So the casting and the kind of relative flatness, visual flatness, are to me flaws.
I did find it got creepy for me, which I think it's meant to, and worked for me, really worked for me. So when you get into this mansion where there's all these weird cast of characters and clearly something's going on and you don't know at this point, sort of, you might have your theories, but you don't know who Fedora is exactly. It turns out you won't know, and what the relationships with these characters are. I got a sense, and I'm not joking, of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Oh, really?
Like there's I can't remember if it's the original film, but certainly in the remake there's a very weird kind of deep South American hick creepy family, and this had a feeling of that for me, of like creepiness and secrets and a prison, and are you going to get out and someone's going to die horribly, I started to think. And then there's that scene with
well, you weren't wrong.
No. Well, the family clears out and he goes to her room, and he sees the straps on her bed, and you think, God, something's happened. And then he sees that corner of the wallpaper that's just peeling away, and you see a snatch of a photo of Michael York's face. He pulls it down, and it's this terrifying, mad shrine to Michael York.
Yeah.
It was so scary. I got super scared by that. What the hell is going on in this? It descended into madness at that point.
Yes, it's kind of, that's, I think, where the Gothic dimension comes in. These mansions with secrets, with mother-daughter relationships, with sexual deviancy, right? Because actually, I think another thing, when the daughter says, I want to tell everyone my mother is gay, you think, my God, that could have been filmed in such a powerful way. and actually it's just flat, right? And I hated the little girl actress.
Yeah, oh yeah, she
So
was absolutely hideous.
so
Yeah,
actually, I think there are real questions about this. So I think it's a film of like wonderful ideas and really kind of quite potent imagery. Yeah, but that remains potent at a conceptual level rather than in an audiovisual way. Yeah.
I know what you mean.
When they bring down that curtain with Michael York's face, it's almost like the camera's static, right? Yeah, I mean, you could have expected it to move in, to have a montage of the faces, to do something with that idea that is not just a
Yeah,
curtain falling down, right?
I think might have actually wet my pants though if they'd done that. It was so scary. And there's something so scary about it being Michael York. He's such an innocent, beautiful, unassuming figure.
Well, actually, this is again, I think, a fault with casting because, of course, in the mid 70s, Michael York was a name, because of the Three Musketeer films and because of Cabaret and so on, you know, but he's just, and I mean, I remember finding him very attractive in Cabaret. I had a real crush on him, right? That kind of look that he has. But of course, he's just not good enough. He lacks dynamism and. So I think that casting is also a kind of failure, and I think it really speaks to who they could get rather than who's ideal in the part. And I think that really goes all along the cast, which of course it's a normal problem with films, right? Like filmmakers
Yeah.
often don't get their ideal cast, but I think Billy Wilder is someone who almost always did, right?
Well, I mean, when you compare the casting real people in this and in Sunset Boulevard, he's got Buster Keaton and Cecil B. DeMille.
Yes. Well, and Gloria Swanson and William Holden.
And no, but I mean casting people as themselves.
Yeah.
Specifically, like comparing Michael York to those. But
Well,
yeah,
no,
exactly.
but I mean,
it's on a totally.
there is also Henry Fonda in this, right? I mean, that's not kind of.
Oh yes, that's true.
Chopped liver. But even the way that he's filmed in this, again, this is an example of it to me. So the idea is wonderful. He comes in this boat in the Aegean Sea, right? And it's Henry Fonda, right? It's supposed to be magnificent, right? And visually, it's flat, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering as well why. When I was thinking about why this flopped at the box office, I think you pick up on, particularly with the casting, and that's a clear kind of indication. But I also thought maybe. Because it starts off with this such a classic noir setup, the same again as Sunset Boulevard, voiceover 2 weeks ago, we're going to unravel a mystery. These are things that certainly in these days are pastiched and parodied and seen as kind of quite comical. Was it the case? This is 30 years on from sort of noir. Now, was it the case that in 78, this was already seen as kind of passé? Was the film trying to evoke a genre that was dead, and people didn't take seriously?
No, I mean, the 1970s hosted a whole revival of noir. The Last Goodbye, that was Altman's, fabulous kind of reworking of noir. There was also remakes of Farewell, My Lovely, and so on. Then actually, I think the Coens came with, what was it? Blood Simple was what, 1980 or early 1980s? So actually, if you bookend kind of, if you begin with something like Chinatown, The Long Goodbye, the remake of Farewell, My Lovely, and then kind of Barton Fink, this whole period saw a real revival of deployment of film noir tropes, in contemporary films of the period. So, but the thing is,
so this is just a failed example of it rather than.
Well, I think this film should have been a film noir, but certainly it's not filmed as one.
No.
Yeah. So
no, I mean, you think you're crying out for a Dutch angle somewhere.
Yes, and lighting and and so on. But the thing is that what we're seeing as kind of gothic, Billy Wilder knew was true, right? So he'd been great pals with Dietrich throughout their life, really. And so he knew her well. A lot of the dialogue, it feels almost like out of Maria Riva's biography of her mother, right? So, what we're seeing as Gothic, he probably saw as realistic. Yeah, kind of the struggles that these women make, the facelifts, the diets, the wheeling and dealing, the kind of the sexual politics of, getting parts and maintaining stardom and so on. The willingness to erase a daughter, or and so on. I mean, those are things that he kind of probably knew firsthand, and that he didn't see probably in a particularly phantasmatic way. I'm speculating, but I have read, kind of all of this. I think the reference to Noel Coward, for example, is not accidental. The reference to the mother's bisexuality is not accidental. I mean, that was Dietrich, and one can play all these games about, kind of which elements of the story have a kind of a real life equivalent. And actually, there are quite a lot of them. I mean, Dietrich famously shut once she felt she was no longer uh, good looking enough. She shut herself in her apartment in Paris and never saw anyone again. She came out once because she needed money desperately, and that's about it. When she did that cameo in that Just a Gigolo film with David Bowie, yeah. So these things have a resonance, yeah. Um, I also think they speak to a different time. They speak to a time where people went to the films two or three times a week. The films were huge. They were in black and white. The kind of faces invaded, kind of, or people lost themselves in people's faces and actors' faces, and those faces had an almost totemistic quality, that they lack now. And all of those things are referenced, I think, in the film, maybe in ways that seem pastiche to us now, just because we don't recognize its power. Yeah. So I mean, so we think, that people waiting in line at the funeral, that's so excessive, for a film star, right? Like now you just go on Twitter and say R.I.P. Right? Yeah. So the fact that these faces could have been so powerful kind of doesn't feel quite real to us. Though, I think it would have felt real to Wilder. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it made me think of Princess Diana's funeral, actually.
Ah.
Because I went to that. Or I should say I was taken to that, because I was like 10 years old.
Yes.
9 years old, in fact. So, we did the whole queuing up and seeing the whole crowd. I mean, it was a bigger funeral than the one in Fedora. And it has a state funeral feeling to it in Fedora, Yes. And that's the idea. She's that important. Maybe another criticism of the film would be that you actually don't get enough of a visceral sense of why she was such a big star.
Yes.
But maybe not, because you basically see her that once when she's in her youth, and the William Holden character when he's younger, it basically sort of yawns and ignores her and ends up pulling her because of that, and she's insistent that she's got an incredible body and so on and so forth. And I guess you can see why people would be after her, but it's not a visceral sense. Most of the time you spend with her is in this old age thing, where she's looking back on who she was.
I think you've hit on something that is an important lack in the film, because you're constantly told that she played Madame Bovary and Lola Montez and like all these great historical figures, right? Which is some idiot's idea of great drama is to have played all these great historical figures, but actually you're never once told what her persona was. Kind of. We know what Dietrich signified, why she continues to, entrance and so on, right? It's like her attitude and, her lack of sentimentality and her bisexuality and, kind of her sleekness and her beauty and, kind of what she represented to different kinds of people. We know that. But actually, we never get told what Fedora's persona was. I mean, we get told she was a great actress and a great star, but why was she? What did she mean to people? What did she signify? We don't know.
If anything, the one real concrete thing that you get is that she had all of these love letters from admirers who were, the most famous men in the world.
Yes.
Like can't remember who it was, Tchaikovsky or some composer, and Picasso, Winston Churchill, all these people. So like basically the thing that her defining sort of feature in Stardom seems to be that loads of men wanted to sleep with her. Maybe that's another way in which the film does not have the highest opinion of women, because that seems to be all it kind of values in her as a star.
No, I don't agree, because actually, there's something kind of interesting about Stardom. So, some of the biggest stars of the 1890s were like the famous courtesans, right, who had their picture in postcards and so on, and who were chaste and kept as mistresses by the aristocracy of the day, and they were pan-European celebrities, right, stars in their own way, yeah, La Belle Otero and people like that. So, this idea of being able to attract kind of the rich and the powerful, and she says, these are my medals, that made sense to me. It was certainly true of Dietrich, right, who kind of, made sport of it. But actually, I think even someone like Dietrich, she's got this line where she says, she tells her daughter, most children inherit their medals from their father. You will inherit yours from your mother, because she was involved in the war, right? And she won the Légion d'honneur, and she was at the front, and she was very brave and correct. Yeah. So there is something there. Yeah, to reduce the medals to just who you slept with, to Dietrich's war medals, say. But actually, there's also something that is conveying, something about the desirability, the star power, the, expectations and kind of discourses around being a particular type of glamorous sex symbol. Yeah.
Shall we talk about Sunset Boulevard for a little bit?
Okay.
Because that's the other film that I watched tonight. I'd not seen it before, and you didn't bother watching it. You're familiar with it, and you had to go to bed because you're.
Well, I just didn't have time. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have minded watching it again. I love it, but I have seen it many times. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we've been making comparisons with it, or at least I have the whole way through, and I think it's because there's a lot to very straight up compare. Like Fedora seems in so many ways to be directly referencing Sunset Boulevard, down to the line that Fedora has at the end where she says it's all about the final close up, and Sunset Boulevard is so famous. The structural problem that I had with Sunset Boulevard that I mentioned was, again, with the kind of flashback structure. You start off with it's a famous image, and one that I was familiar with, of William Holden face down in the pool, and then it's how we're going to find out how we got there. And I thought that I went with it, and I was interested in seeing how things developed. But actually, once you got into the sort of second half of the film, I found that it started to become it actually felt like a burden that the film had, because I thought, this film is interesting and enjoyable, and I'm into it, and I don't need this thing about, but we're going to find out soon how he got into the pool and how he died. I didn't need that hanging over me. I didn't need the film to be going, but this is coming up. Actually, I thought if you tell this story chronologically, it is good enough to stand up. I didn't need that. So actually, I started to lose interest, because I thought, I wish somehow I had more faith in itself. I really don't like that technique. I must say, I really don't like that.
Well, I mean, there are stories behind it. I don't think that was Wilder's first choice. So I think that, that beginning with the end and the corpse stalking, is something that was an add-in. And my memory is not clear on this. It might have been due to censorship.
Right.
Yeah, kind of, because the whole thing about Sunset Boulevard is so powerful. And again, you have to look at it historically, right? It is basically about a gigolo, about a man selling himself, right? For opportunity. I mean, yeah. So, and it's very sexual, and it's very creepily sexual. It is about, a man in his prime, at his most attractive, kind of, convincing himself that it's okay to sleep with this very old woman. Yeah. Out of financial necessity. It's like the whole thing is abhorrent.
Very old and deluded as well. I mean, it's like she's not completely in charge of herself.
Well, but
and he buys into this.
You find that out gradually, and almost you find that out along kind of with him, really. So, the amounts of like self-hatred that you have at the very beginning, that William Holden's character evokes, is is actually something that is missing from Fedora. Yeah, it's kind of, you really feel that. Yeah, he is a gigolo, and he hates being a gigolo, and actually he does have kind of moral standards, and maybe he should have gone back home to Kansas or whatever, it's wherever he's from, right? But instead he finds himself kind of, selling himself sexually. I can't think of another film in the classic era. I mean, you often have like gigolos for fun, yeah, like an old countess with a young man or whatever, but kind of from the gigolo's point of view, and that evocation of like self disgust or disgust at oneself, it's very powerful.
I think what you say about us discovering that she's sort of unstable along with him, I don't think that's entirely true. It seems this is coming to it from a position of knowing in broad strokes how the story goes and what happens before I've seen it. So admittedly, there's that. But, from the second you meet her, really, and she starts to engage with William Holden, it's Inglorious Wanson's performance, the wild faces that she pulls, and the thing about, having to be in every scene of the film, and I'm big, the pictures got small, and, like, it's right there from the beginning, a kind of self-obsession, and there's something about this woman that does not match up with the world around her.
Okay, but, yeah, I think you get that gradually. I mean, my feeling at all those things, that's just how a silent film star, because actually, if somebody like Fedora in the sound era was famous, somebody like Gloria Swanson was world famous, right? Like, without that, the level of fame. I think when Gloria Swanson married the Marquis de la Falaise, and she went on a train, there were like thousands and thousands of people just waving to her at the train all along America. Right, it's kind of like a level of fame and kind of image worship or something that we just don't really have anymore. I mean, fame, yes, I suppose everybody knows who a Kardashian is, but the idea of having this affective connection with them, that you would literally go and spend the whole day just so you can wave at them on a train, that is kind of like, I mean, we saw that with Princess Diana in this country, but it wasn't worldwide, and there's nothing like that nationwide. A silent film actress like Gloria Swanson enjoyed that. So this idea that they're full of themselves or they have a particular worldview, to me that's kind of understandable. It's not yet nuts.
Oh no, I don't mean it in terms of I'm not suggesting that she's full of herself. That wouldn't be the way I'd put it. But there is a disconnect between the way that she. I mean, the thing is, the life that you describe of being worshipped, will not make a person more sane.
No, I get.
And the way that Norma Desmond starts off in this film is in this old house. I mean, it's even introduced to us in voiceover as. Miss Havisham, like a Miss Havisham house, he says, and there's just her in there and this one butler. So
it's like Dietrich in her late life. That is like Dietrich in her later life with her butler in her Paris apartment that was paid for by the French government, right? Because of her importance. Shut in, like.
So there is an obvious disconnect, kind of right from the start, that whoever this woman may have been and may believe that she still is in the wider world is not the case. Not the case anymore. And so I think that does come across to me as fairly apparent, really early on. Not to say like kind of a mental instability that's going to result in obsession and killing someone. That is what develops. But there's a disconnect there, I think, immediately. I had a problem with actually the end of the film. Specifically, the shooting.
Uh-huh.
The moment the shooting happened, I didn't like it because it didn't feel justified, right? She's losing her mind and she's crazy and she needs him and she doesn't want him to go, and she has a gun, but it's a deliberate shooting, and that did not play to me because I thought actually what happens here, realistically, is she doesn't want him to go and he goes and she breaks down crying. That's to me what actually felt more realistic, and what would have then felt more justified in terms of shooting would be if either Max, the butler / first husband, shot him as a way to protect her delusion, or if she shot him in error, whatever it was, the gun went off by accident, she tripped, she didn't know what she was doing, it was an accident that she shot him, which would have then continued to make sense because you ultimately do need her going down the stairs, and you need the irony of the TV cameras that have shown up because she's a murderer, her mistaking them or believing that they're film cameras, and so instead of stepping into the limelight, she's stepping into jail at the end. You need that irony, I think. So it has to be her that kills him. But I didn't buy the actual shooting.
Well, I did, and I think kind of this way that you're explaining kind of the logical, reasonable expectations is to me the wrong way of going about it, because there's a reason why the film has been turned into a musical, and a really operatic kind of musical, of kind of delusions and delirium and love, and and actually it's because that's the vein that the film is kind of communicating with. So that kind of like logic, obviously, there has to be a degree of it to make sense, but then in Norma Desmond's mind, it goes into something else that is understandable.
I do understand what you mean. For me, that would have just needed to be conveyed slightly differently, slightly more in a slightly more justified way. Like, because I went back and watched that a few times because I wanted to really get the measure of it. And there's no close up on her, right? He's staggering out to the car, and it's a wide shot from kind of quite high up, and he's sort of closer to the front of the frame. She's further in the background by the house, and she shoots him. And there's no moment where you like. I wanted to see the anger and the fear and the craziness and the loss of control in her eyes. That's what would have sold that to me. It's maybe one missing shot would have done it. I just didn't buy it in that moment, but I did buy it then as it developed into her falling into complete delusion. I loved that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't comment on that because I have seen the film many times. I never get tired of watching it. I think it is an absolute masterpiece of the cinema. But actually, those relays of shots that you're just describing, I simply can't remember.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
So what about Sunset Boulevard kind of helps you appreciate or understand Fedora better?
There's clearly continuity in the two films of a critique of Hollywood and Stardom, as I say, to some extent. And I think they are slightly different. Fedora is about beauty and about the fear of loss of identity in a slightly different way to Sunset Boulevard. But Sunset Boulevard is about loss of identity with Swanson's character, but it's about the fear of a loss of who she is in other people's eyes.
Well, you see, to me, if Martha Keller had been better, you'd be able to make similarities between the William Holden character in Sunset Boulevard and the daughter. Yes, because actually they're both erased, they're both bought. One does it for affection, out of a need of affection for the mother. The other one does it out of a way of surviving and, having a career. The Gloria Swanson, the Norma Desmond character, and the real Fedora / Countess character also kind of, have a lot in common, really. I mean, basically they suck up everybody else, including the first husband and so on. Now, what Sunset Boulevard has that Fedora doesn't is that there's something endearing and lovable about crazy Norma Desmond. There's a reason why the first husband is there serving her and helping her and making sense of the world. Yeah, you never understand why, the Countess's coterie is there. Yeah, so that you later understand why the Count, played by Hans Jarre, is there. And obviously the companion is meant to be also a kind of lover, I suppose, so that is explained. Why the doctor follows them around, and becomes part of the coterie when he's a famous doctor who's got this huge clinic. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me.
I think, doesn't he have dialogue about having been discredited? Which is why I think in that scene where he's talking to William Holden early on in the hotel lobby.
that would explain it, actually. So you understand why Fedora basically kills her daughter. Yeah. But actually, that's not communicated dramatically, powerfully enough. Yeah, so basically you're told why she does. I mean, I think the thing is that the central character in the film needed to have been the Countess Fedora, the old lady, in the same way that Gloria Swanson was at the center of Sunset Boulevard, right? So actually, maybe that's interesting. Maybe that's where you're thinking about the structure makes might be insightful because, you know, kind of. So you, well, I'm just
That's
thinking aloud.
generous. Yeah,
Well,
I know. Yeah, I know.
I rejected it the first time, so now I'm just thinking, because you get the producer William Holden's view, then Chase and so on in the first part, right? And the Marth Keller younger Fedora daughter breaches or crosses both sections, but actually the mother, the real Fedora, remains kind of vague on the sidelines in the shadows, right, until the end and at the funeral, yeah. And even then, you have information from other sources, right? And actually, you needed to understand better emotionally, yeah, what drives a woman to do that to her daughter, right? Because yes, she wants to maintain her fame. Yes, she wants to maintain the image and so on. But actually, you don't get enough of her point of view on her relationship with her daughter.
Her relationship with her daughter is a very complicated one because you have this thing of her daughter rejecting her when she's very young because she doesn't spend enough time with her. Her stardom's more important, and then she comes back, and she's happy to have her back in her life. But then emotional connection, I guess you see in some of those flashbacks, and then it sort of starts to disappear. And then by the time you get to the funeral, no one is upset that the daughter's dead.
Yes.
And that's very peculiar because it's not to say they should be upset. They could be incredibly cold, harsh people, but then that feels not communicated.
Yes.
If that's the case.
I mean, she's robbing her daughter even of her funeral. Yeah, it becomes the funeral of Fedora. Teams of plastic surgeons have been working around the clock for 2 days to restore her look to that of Fedora, right? And there should have been something, I think, about her daughter. It's her daughter who's dead. Does she feel nothing? Right? I mean, you suspect that, she has to feel something, even if she then has to rationalize it. Yeah. So that to me is also like a little bit of a reason for the film's failure. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we completely finish, I do want to say like 2 positive things about Sunset Boulevard because I've basically picked up on 2 things that I didn't like very much.
Uh-huh.
And like I say, although I did just sit there picking up on flaws really because I thought, oh, isn't this supposed to be the greatest, blah blah blah, and that's what happens. I will return to this film and I will watch it again, and I'm sure I'll enjoy it more. And I think it's really funny. There's loads and loads of good dialogue and well-delivered dialogue. As there is in Fedora, I think Fedora is very funny as well, but Sunset Boulevard is more funny. Yes. There was one bit in particular which I don't even know if I meant to find it funny, but I howled with laughter, which is when William Holden meets Norma Desmond for the first time, and she's talking about wanting to do Salome. I got the script up here to remember the dialogue. He says, and you'll play Salome? Who else? Only asking, I didn't know you were planning a comeback. And she says, I hate that word. It is a return to the millions of people who have never forgiven me for deserting the screen. Yeah. And she holds this kind of mad face. And off screen, he says, fair enough. And that's such a non-kind of answer to what she's just said in this super dramatic way. I really, really laughed at that. I loved it. So I think it was really funny. And, whether that is a deliberate joke or not, there are loads. And I also think that it is incredibly visually expressive. And,
yes.
Maybe, again, that's just taken for granted. But certainly towards the end, when she makes that phone call to the girl, whatever her name was, and, he walks in the back through the door and it's his silhouette and he approaches. And there's some beautiful, expressive, dark cinematography going on there that I loved.
Yes.
So, it's hardly going out my way to say, oh, by the way, this film was actually good. But it is good, and I will watch it again.
Yeah. And actually, to return to Fedora, I think Fedora is also wonderful. I mean, I think, throughout this whole podcast, we've been talking about, why it's a failure. And we haven't maybe been talking enough about why it's a perfect failure. I think I think it's a really complex film. It's really interesting. It's got all of these films that are intricately worked through. It is also very funny, I think, you know, and it's kind of, one of the great directors' kind of point of view on Hollywood and celebrity that is always kind of worth listening to and seeing. I'm very glad that the film, is being in a way revived. I really think it deserves to be revived. Yeah. And I would urge people to see it. So thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much for listening.
Bye-bye.